in philosophy we learn a lot of different ontologies or metaphysics of mind. In other words, talking about the relationship between mind and matter. Physicalism is one, and that ramifies into many different types. Dualism is another, that also ramifies into different types. But at Exeter University, speaking to a lot of scientists, psychologists especially, it seems that most of them, and the man on the street, believe that there's really just two options, which is either materialism or physicalism and dualism. And I always tell them, you realize that there's a few more than that, and even those are quite ambiguous terms which can be, divided into types, as I said. And they're like, really? So I thought, and then when looking at psychedelic research, where people have what I call metaphysical experiences, I realized that if you're just going to look at those two main options, in addition to mystical experience, then you're going to limit yourselves. So I developed a matrix which I had created in my PhD on panpsychism to show, 5 basic types of ontology. In other words, 5 different types of ways in which you can understand the relationship between mind, matter, and also the transcendent. But as well, I cut through it with panpsychism, because panpsychism can be any of those 5 in different varieties, and also theism, including atheism. So I created this metaphysics menu, and so instead of giving 2 types of ontologies, physicalism and dualism, I give 5 main ones, and those are then physicalism, dualism or substance dualism, so mind and matter are completely distinct and interact. But I also give idealism, which is the view that mind projects matter, as it were, as well as monism or neutral monism. So, for example, the view of Spinoza that mind and matter are both merely expressions of something much deeper, what he calls substance or nature or God, Spinoza's case. And then a 5th column, which is the transcendent, by which I mean phenomena or realities such as Plato's forms, the subsistence of possibility, potentiality, perhaps even different dimensions of space. So those are the 5 columns then, and as I say, cutting through those, we have panpsychism, so you can get physicalist panpsychism, Galen Strawson's variety, real naturalism as he calls it. You can get idealist panpsychism, such as that of Schopenhauer. You can get monist panpsychism, which is what I sort of prefer personally, which is Spinoza's, Whitehead's kind of view, and so on and so forth. So by providing this metaphysics matrix, as I call it, it's basically a menu for scientists to understand very quickly, one image, that physicalism and dualism is a false dichotomy. So this matrix has, within that matrix, you have 40 items, 40 different views. And that's associated with the MMQ, or the Metaphysics Matrix Questionnaire, which is appendix to that article. And this questionnaire can be used to understand, I argue, certain psychedelic experiences. For example, idealism. Humphrey Davy took 200 pints of nitrous oxide and sort of expressed an idealism, or pantheism, for example. These views are really missed out in the standard mystical experience questionnaires, like the MEQ or the Hood scale or whatever. So this provides a more comprehensive way of understanding such experiences, but not only in terms of classifying them as such, but also in terms of understanding them. So with mysticism, you have the mystical experience, and by definition, it remains at the level of mysticism. But with metaphysics, you can have the same experience, but if you classify it as metaphysical, then you have the associated intellectual system through which one can understand what one has what one seems to have experienced. And so my argument is that in the integrative phase of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, in the integrative phase, one can use metaphysics to make sense of and give significance to that experience in a participant's therapy. Yeah, so it's 2023 now, and we are at least 10 years into the so-called psychedelic renaissance, or the psychedelic turn, where we suddenly realized, or a lot of therapists and scientists realize, and governments realize, that psychedelics don't necessarily fry your brain, but actually can be, on the contrary, rather therapeutic. So what this psychedelic turn has offered is mostly a lot of neurological trials trying to gauge the sort of correlates of psychedelic experience, and in turn clinical trials to see how that might be of therapeutic value for people suffering depression, addiction, anxiety, fear, and so on. End-of-life treatment, even OCD. But as I sort of mentioned, the metaphysics, the actual analysis of the experience at the moment is pretty shallow. And that's partly because, of course, psychologists, neuroscientists, whatever, haven't studied metaphysics. Why haven't they studied it? That's because the 20th century really turned its back on metaphysics, unfortunately, in my view. We had in England, I'll speak of my own experience, or my own culture. In England, in Britain, we had a lot of idealism, a lot of metaphysics in Oxbridge and Edinburgh and so on in the early 20th century, late 19th century. The British idealists were kind of, very popular at the time. It's the sort of lineage of Hegel's idealism into Britain. But then early on, we suddenly had a kind of reaction to that, which was the logical positivism, which basically said that all of that sort of metaphysics, idealism, monism, and so on, that is nonsense, literally nonsense. It doesn't make sense. It has no meaning. It's just words, play on words, really. You had people like A.J. Ayer write an essay in the 1930s about the impossibility of metaphysics, and then logical behaviorism became quite prevalent in the West, in psychology and philosophy, and consciousness became a bad word. Metaphysics was really sort of unspeakable, and then as a result, scientists didn't look at metaphysics. They didn't really look at consciousness, phenomenology. At least in science, was ignored pretty much. But then the end of the 20th century, that logical positivism, that logical behaviorism led to all these logical problems themselves, and that has now been sort of discarded with the realization that there was an underlying metaphysics there anyway. So you can never really get rid of metaphysics. And for the last 20-30 years, we have, or about 20-30 years ago, we have gone through the metaphysical turn, which means that we are now teaching metaphysics in university again, and we are not as dismissive of it. On the contrary, new theories are coming out all the time. Panpsychism is becoming quite popular at the moment. For example, panpsychism, the view that all entities, all beings, have a form of sentience, whether it's consciousness or basic primitive forms of desire. So the metaphysics turn has occurred, the psychedelic turn has occurred, and what I'm interested in is the point at which they meet, and that's where we're beginning to look at now. Well, it is certainly a hard problem, so I don't have a definite answer to that. But I will say this, that a lot of philosophers say that the difficulty, the hardness of the hard problem of consciousness really lies with our conception of matter rather than mind. And I believe that this sort of the continuing evolution, as it were, of physics might help us in this regard. David Bohm, who is a sort of a kind of inspirational figure here in Pari, I mean, he argued that a unification of relativity quantum physics was impossible, probably impossible, he said, and we will see both of those theories as abstractions, as limited views of something far deeper. And I think this chimes well with Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy as well, that mind and matter, well, matter is an abstraction as we understand it. If you look at the evolution of matter, we see it changing all the time, from being pure extension to attaining mass, charge, spin, so on and so forth, you know. So we shouldn't believe that we're at the end of that procedure, not at all. We know we're not at the end, because we know that physics is incomplete. Therefore, my kind of hope in a way is that as physics develops, elements of mind will pop into that. Already we see that with the observer effect, for example. So I think that when we understand matter more, we will understand the role of mind or consciousness more in reality. And so ultimately, I think my prediction would be this, that the more we understand matter, the more we understand it to be an abstraction that in its concreteness will begin to, as we understand it more concretely, we'll understand that it contains mind more. And then ultimately the most parsimonious view would be, this is really Whitehead and Spinoza, that mind and matter are the same thing. They're just two expressions of the same thing. And that would be a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Monism at the moment is a kind of solution to the hard problem of consciousness, but we don't know why mind and matter seem to be so different. So with the evolution of physics, perhaps phenomenology as well, we'll see that coming together. That's my prediction, but I don't know.